Chapter 1. Arrival at Seaview Resort. It was a particularly fine day in late June when Miss Jane Marple arrived at Dalmore Bay. The sun shone with gentle warmth upon the quaint seaside town, its rays glittering across the surface of the calm sea. Miss Marple had been looking forward to her annual summer holiday for quite some time, having spent the previous months enduring the particularly bitter winter that had descended upon St. Mary Mead. As the taxi pulled up before the grand entrance of the Seaview Hotel, Miss Marple observed with quiet appreciation the elegant Edwardian architecture of the establishment. White-painted balconies adorned with intricate ironwork overlooked the magnificent bay, while well-tended gardens surrounded the property on 3 sides. The 4th side, she noted, appeared to drop away rather dramatically towards what must be a cliff face above the beach. "Here we are, ma'am. Seaview Hotel," announced the driver, a ruddy-faced man who proceeded to retrieve her modest luggage. Miss Marple thanked him, paid the fare with careful precision, and made her way inside. The foyer was everything one might expect of a respectable seaside hotel: polished marble floors, tasteful furnishings, and the distinct aroma of beeswax polish that suggested meticulous housekeeping. "Miss Marple, we are delighted to welcome you back," said Mr. Peterson, the hotel manager, a tall, thin man with impeccably combed silver hair and a dignified bearing. "Room 12 has been prepared for you as requested, the one with the charming view of the garden and sea." "How very kind of you to remember, Mr. Peterson," replied Miss Marple with a gentle smile. "I do so appreciate the consideration." Mrs. Lacey, the housekeeper, appeared almost immediately, a plump, efficient woman with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "Everything is just as you prefer, Miss Marple. Fresh flowers from the garden, and I've made sure you have an extra blanket should the evening turn chilly." Before Miss Marple could express her gratitude, a young man in a smart uniform stepped forward to collect her bags. "James will show you to your room," said Mr. Peterson. "Dinner is served at 7, as usual." As they ascended the grand staircase, Miss Marple noticed a young maid dusting the ornate banister. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 20, glanced up and offered a quick, polite smile. "That's Violet, ma'am," James informed her, following her gaze. "Started this season. Sharp as a tack, that one. Notices everything. An admirable quality in hotel staff," observed Miss Marple pleasantly. Once settled in her room, Miss Marple took a moment to appreciate the view before unpacking her belongings with methodical care. The afternoon sun cast a golden hue across the waters of the bay, and several small boats bobbed gently near the jetty. It was most pleasant indeed. At precisely 6:30, Miss Marple made her way downstairs to the lounge for a pre-dinner sherry. It was there that she first observed the Montgomerys. The newlyweds made quite an entrance. He, a handsome man of perhaps 35 with dark hair and an attentive, almost watchful demeanor. She, a striking blonde no more than 25, adorned with jewelry that was perhaps a touch too extravagant for a seaside resort. The Montgomerys murmured Lady Westbrook, who had taken a seat beside Miss Marple. The widow was a regular fixture at the hotel, her aristocratic features framed by perfectly coiffed silver hair. "Married just last month, I understand. She's wearing enough diamonds to sink a small yacht." Miss Marple nodded, observing the protective manner in which Mr. Montgomery guided his wife to their seats, his hand firmly at her elbow, his eyes constantly scanning the room, most devoted, one might think, or perhaps something else entirely. Dinner proved to be a pleasant affair, with several other guests making their presence known. There were the Hendersons, a middle-aged couple of comfortable means, who spoke little but observed much. Mr. Simmons, a quiet businessman who claimed to be taking a brief respite from London's financial district, and Professor Parker, a retired academic with a penchant for maritime history. It was during the fish course that Miss Marple noticed something curious. As a waiter leaned in to serve Mrs. Montgomery, the young bride visibly stiffened, her face momentarily draining of color. The waiter, too, seemed to pause for just a fraction longer than necessary, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly before he continued with his duties. Later that evening, as Miss Marple took a turn about the garden to enjoy the cool evening air, she found herself inadvertently witness to a tense exchange. The Montgomerys stood partially concealed by a large hydrangea bush, their voices low but urgent. "You're being ridiculous," Harold Montgomery was saying, his grip on his wife's arm causing her to wince slightly. "No one here knows anything." "You don't understand," Elaine replied, her voice trembling. "They'll recognize me eventually. It's only a matter of time." Miss Marple quietly retreated, careful not to disturb the gravel beneath her sensible shoes. As she made her way back to the hotel entrance, she couldn't help but wonder what precisely Mrs. Montgomery feared might be recognized, and by whom. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Bride. The following morning dawned with a peculiar mist, hovering over Dalmore Bay, shrouding the water in a gauzy veil that seemed to Miss Marple rather symbolic of the events that would soon unfold. She descended for breakfast promptly at 8:30, having always believed that punctuality was among the most essential virtues. The dining room was already occupied by several guests, including Professor Parker, who was engrossed in his newspaper, and the Hendersons, who were engaged in the sort of comfortable silence that accompanies long matrimony. Miss Marple selected a modest portion of scrambled eggs and toast from the sideboard, and took her customary table by the window, where she could observe both the gradually lifting mist and her fellow guests with equal attentiveness. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when Harold Montgomery entered alone. He appeared slightly disheveled, his usual immaculate appearance somewhat compromised by what seemed to be a hasty preparation. He glanced about the room with an expression that Miss Marple found most interesting, a curious mixture of anxiety and forced nonchalance. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," called Lady Westbrook from her table. "Is your charming wife still abed? The young do enjoy their sleep, I suppose." "Elaine is feeling rather unwell this morning," he replied, his tone carefully modulated. "Nothing serious, I assure you, merely a slight headache. She's asked not to be disturbed and will likely remain in our room until luncheon." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. There was something in the man's manner that struck her as not quite right. It reminded her rather forcibly of young Tommy Simmons back in St. Mary Mead, who had once insisted with similar conviction that he had not taken Mrs. Wilkins' prize-winning roses, despite having soil beneath his fingernails and a suspicious scratch upon his cheek. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple observed subtle shifts in the hotel's routine. Violet the maid emerged from the service door, looking distinctly flustered after what should have been her regular cleaning of the first-floor rooms, which included the Montgomerys' suite. James the bellhop seemed to hover near the main staircase more frequently than usual, his gaze often traveling upward with an expression of puzzlement. It was just before noon when Miss Marple, seated in the conservatory with her knitting, witnessed a small drama unfold. A telegraph boy arrived, and Mr. Peterson personally accepted the message. After a brief examination of the envelope, the manager summoned James and dispatched him upstairs with the telegram. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically as she observed Harold Montgomery intercept the young man in the foyer, taking the telegram with visible agitation. The color drained from his face as he read its contents. He crumpled the paper into his pocket with trembling fingers before composing himself and approaching the reception desk, where he engaged in a brief, hushed conversation with Mr. Peterson. By afternoon tea, a curious tension had settled over the hotel. Miss Marple, enjoying a perfectly prepared scone with clotted cream and strawberry preserve, could not help but notice the increased frequency with which staff members glanced toward the main staircase. Harold Montgomery had disappeared after luncheon, which he had taken alone in a secluded corner of the dining room. "I do hope Mrs. Montgomery is recovering," remarked Professor Parker, who had joined Miss Marple for tea. Her husband mentioned at lunch that she had gone out for some air and a bit of shopping in the village. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed? How curious! I understood she was confined to her room with a headache." The professor shrugged, his attention already drifting back to his book on local maritime history. It was shortly after 5 o'clock when the atmosphere in the hotel shifted decisively from curious tension to genuine concern. Harold Montgomery, now visibly distressed, approached Mr. Peterson at the reception desk, his voice loud enough to carry across the foyer. "I insist you check again. She cannot simply have vanished. My wife must be somewhere in the hotel or grounds." Mr. Peterson's response was too quiet to discern, but his professional composure appeared somewhat strained. Lacey was summoned, and a hurried conference ensued, resulting in several staff members being dispatched in various directions. By dinner time, Inspector Collins of the local constabulary had arrived, a solid, methodical man with a weathered face that suggested long exposure to Dalmore Bay's salt air and resident secrets in equal measure. He interviewed Harold Montgomery in the small writing room, their conversation shielded by closed doors but occasionally punctuated by raised voices. Miss Marple, making her way to dinner, passed Violet in the corridor. The young maid appeared troubled, twisting her apron between nervous fingers. "Is everything quite all right, Violet?" inquired Miss Marple, gently. "It's very strange, ma'am," the girl replied in a hushed tone. "I went to turn down the beds in the Montgomery's room, and all Mrs. Montgomery's things are still there, her brushes on the dressing table, her nightgown laid out, even her novel, with the bookmark still in place. But Mr. Montgomery says she went shopping hours ago, and her jewelry?" asked Miss Marple, almost conversationally. Violet's eyes widened. "That's just it, ma'am. The jewelry case is empty. I noticed because it was left open on the dressing table, which seemed odd. After dinner, which was a subdued affair with Harold Montgomery conspicuously absent, Miss Marple took a brief constitutional along the terrace. The mist had returned with the evening, wreathing the hotel in ghostly tendrils and reducing the moon to a diffuse glow. As she reached the far end of the terrace, which overlooked the path down to the beach, she observed Inspector Collins and James examining something on the ground with the aid of a powerful torch. "It's definitely hers," James was saying as Miss Marple approached. "I noticed Mrs. Montgomery wearing it at dinner last night. Distinctive pattern of little roses along the edge." Inspector Collins straightened up, holding what appeared to be a lady's silk scarf. In the beam of the torch, Miss Marple could discern dark spots upon the delicate fabric that the encroaching night and swirling mist did their best to obscure, but which her experienced eye recognized all too well. "Found it caught on the rocks just off the path," said the inspector grimly, "about halfway down to the beach." Chapter 3. Deadly Discovery. Dawn broke over Dalmore Bay with a dismal grey temperament that seemed to acknowledge the grim events unfolding at the Seaview Hotel. Miss Marple, who had always been an early riser, was awakened by the sound of urgent voices and hurried footsteps in the corridor outside her room. Donning her dressing gown and attending to her appearance with her customary efficiency, she ventured into the hallway to discover a most unusual degree of activity for such an early hour. "There's been an accident," whispered Mrs. Henderson, who had also emerged from her room, her hair still in curling papers. "A terrible accident down on the beach." With remarkable composure, Miss Marple descended to the foyer, where Inspector Collins was issuing instructions to several constables. The inspector's face bore the weary gravity of a man who had seen his fair share of human tragedy, but had never quite grown accustomed to it. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged with a slight nod, "I'm afraid I must ask all guests to remain in the hotel for the time being." "I understand, Inspector," she replied quietly. "One assumes it concerns Mrs. Montgomery." A flicker of surprise crossed his weathered features. "News travels quickly even at this hour. Yes, I'm afraid a body has been discovered on the beach below. The identification is still preliminary." But he didn't need to finish the sentence. Through the large windows of the foyer, Miss Marple could see figures moving on the beach far below, uniformed constables and what appeared to be a doctor, gathered around something that the morning tide had not yet reached. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with many of the hotel's guests speaking in hushed tones or not at all. Harold Montgomery was nowhere to be seen. Mr. Peterson informed the assembled guests that he was resting under medical supervision, having been quite overcome upon receiving the news. It appears that Mrs. Montgomery may have fallen from the cliff path in the night, the manager explained, his professional demeanor strained by the circumstances. A most tragic accident. The police are, of course, conducting their inquiries, but I must ask for your patience and cooperation during this difficult time. Miss Marple quietly sipped her tea, her bright blue eyes taking in the reactions of her fellow guests. Lady Westbrook appeared genuinely shocked, her aristocratic features pale beneath her perfectly arranged silver hair. Professor Parker muttered something about the dangers of cliff paths in the darkness, while Mr. Simmons seemed unusually interested in his newspaper, though Miss Marple noted that he had been staring at the same page for quite some time. It was mid-morning when Inspector Collins requested a brief interview with each guest. Miss Marple, when her turn came, was shown into the small writing room that had been temporarily requisitioned for police use. "I understand you were among the last to see the deceased yesterday evening, Miss Marple," the inspector began, consulting his notebook. "I believe I observed Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery having a rather intense conversation in the garden," she confirmed. "Though saw might be somewhat misleading. It was more that I overheard them while taking my evening constitutional." As she recounted the exchange she had witnessed, Miss Marple added thoughtfully, "Inspector, if I may make an observation, when I viewed the remains from a distance this morning, I couldn't help but notice some discoloration around what appeared to be the neck area, rather distinct and not what one would typically associate with injuries sustained in a fall." Inspector Collins regarded her with new interest. "You have a keen eye, madam. The doctor has indeed noted some unusual bruising that requires further examination." "I'm merely an observant old woman," Miss Marple demurred. "Living in a small village, one does become rather adept at noticing details." After her interview, Miss Marple sought out Violet, whom she found changing linens in a room at the far end of the first-floor corridor. "Such a dreadful business," the maid whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "And the strangest thing, too, Mrs. Lacey had me change the cleaning schedule yesterday. Usually I do the first floor in the morning, but she had me switch with Ellen, who does the second floor." "Indeed? How curious," murmured Miss Marple. "And was this unusual?" "Never happened before," confirmed Violet. "And when I finally did get to the Montgomerys' room in the afternoon, it looked like someone had already been in. The bed was made differently than how I do it, and the bathroom towels had been changed, but not folded properly, according to hotel standards." This intriguing information was added to Miss Marple's mental catalogue of observations. She spent the remainder of the morning seated in the conservatory, ostensibly focused on her knitting, while actually observing the comings and goings of police officers, hotel staff, and guests. It was shortly after luncheon when James approached her, his youthful face troubled. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, taking the seat beside her. "Inspector Collins mentioned that you have some experience with unusual situations." "I have occasionally been of some small assistance to the authorities," she acknowledged modestly. James lowered his voice. "The thing is, when Mr. Peterson introduced the Montgomerys on their arrival, I had the strangest feeling that I'd met Mrs. Montgomery before. But when I mentioned it to her the next day, she denied it completely, said she'd never been to Dalmore Bay before, and certainly had never met me." "Had you met her before?" inquired Miss Marple gently. "That's just it. I couldn't place her at first, but this morning, when I heard what happened, it suddenly came to me. Last summer there was a young lady staying at the Clifftop Inn on the other side of the bay. She wasn't blonde then. She had dark hair, but I'm certain it was the same person. She was with a gentleman, but it wasn't Mr. Montgomery." Miss Marple thanked him for this information, her needles clicking thoughtfully as James returned to his duties. The afternoon saw her making a discreet examination of the hotel's guest register, and several photographs displayed in the foyer, which commemorated various events held at the Seaview over the years. It was while studying a photograph of last year's summer dance, captured in the hotel's ballroom and prominently displayed near the reception desk, that Miss Marple made a discovery that caused her breath to catch. In the background, barely noticeable among the elegantly attired attendees, was a familiar face, not Elaine Montgomery's, but one that cast the entire situation in a new and disturbing light. "Most illuminating," she murmured to herself, checking her wristwatch against the clock in the foyer. The discrepancy she noted, a full 7 minutes combined with what she had just observed in the photograph, suddenly made the timeline of yesterday's events remarkably clear. As she turned away from the display, Miss Marple nearly collided with Inspector Collins, who was emerging from another interview. "Inspector," she said with quiet urgency, "I believe there may be some aspects of the timetable that require closer examination. The hotel clock, for instance, is 7 minutes fast." The inspector's expression suggested he failed to see the significance of this observation. 7 minutes, Miss Marple repeated meaningfully, during which quite a lot can happen, particularly if one has planned very carefully indeed. Chapter 4. Identities revealed. The following morning brought with it a persistent drizzle that shrouded the Seaview Hotel in a melancholy haze. Miss Marple, dressed in a sensible tweed suit and armed with a sturdy umbrella, made her way into the village of Dalmore Bay with purposeful strides. The cobblestone streets glistened with moisture as she navigated her way to the small post office situated on the high street. The bell above the door tinkled pleasantly as she entered, and Miss Marple was greeted by the postmistress, a woman of approximately 50 with spectacles perched upon her nose and an expression that suggested she was the repository of every morsel of local knowledge. "Good morning," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I wonder if you might assist me. I'm staying at the Seaview Hotel and expecting a rather important letter. I'm curious whether you recall any correspondence being delivered for a Mrs. Elaine Montgomery." The postmistress's eyes lit up with interest. "The lady who had the accident. Dreadful business, that. Can't say I recall anything specific for her, but her husband collected several items just yesterday morning. Seemed in quite a hurry, he did." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "How interesting. And did he receive a telegram by any chance?" "As a matter of fact, he did," the postmistress confirmed, clearly delighted to be of assistance. "Came in just before noon. He was waiting for it, too. Called in twice that morning to inquire." Armed with this small but significant piece of information, Miss Marple thanked the postmistress and made her way back to the hotel. The drizzle had intensified into a more determined rainfall, and she was rather grateful to return to the warmth of the lobby. She found Lady Westbrook in the drawing-room, elegantly arranged upon a chaise longue with a novel that appeared to be more prop than reading material. The aristocratic widow greeted Miss Marple with evident relief at the prospect of conversation. "This dreadful affair has quite unsettled everyone," Lady Westbrook confided as Miss Marple took a seat beside her. "Poor Mr. Montgomery is prostrate with grief, I understand. Hardly surprising, of course." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple. "I believe you mentioned that you were acquainted with Mrs. Montgomery's family?" "Well, not precisely acquainted," Lady Westbrook clarified, lowering her voice, although they were quite alone in the room. "But I knew of the Harringtons. That was her family name, you understand. Old money, very respectable. I attended a garden party at their estate in Surrey, perhaps 15 years ago. The daughter would have been just a child then, of course." "And did you find Mrs. Montgomery much as you would have expected, given her background?" inquired Miss Marple innocently. Lady Westbrook hesitated, her fingers toying with the pearls at her throat. "To be perfectly frank, I found something not quite right about the young woman. Nothing I could specify with any certainty, you understand, but there was something. Perhaps it was merely that these modern young women are so different from what we were accustomed to in my day." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Collins, who requested a moment of Lady Westbrook's time. Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the conservatory, where she found Professor Parker examining a potted fern with scholarly interest. "Fascinating specimens they keep here," he remarked, as Miss Marple joined him. "This particular variety is quite sensitive to changes in routine, the slightest alteration in watering schedules, and they begin to wilt immediately. Much like people," observed Miss Marple. "We are creatures of habit, and deviations from our established patterns often lead to unfortunate results." The professor regarded her curiously. "An interesting philosophy, Miss Marple. You've been quite absorbed in the recent tragedy, I notice." "One cannot help but be affected by such events," she replied, "though I must say I've been equally interested in the hotel's daily routines. For instance, I've observed that breakfast is served precisely at 8:30, and the staff begin their cleaning rounds at 9:45. "You're very observant," said the professor with a smile. "Most guests barely notice the staff at all. Oh, I've always found that the routines of a household, or in this case a hotel, reveal a great deal about its occupants. For instance, I couldn't help but notice that the chambermaids always work in pairs when cleaning the second floor, but individually on the first." This seemingly trivial observation provoked a thoughtful nod from the professor, who soon excused himself for his afternoon constitutional rain notwithstanding. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple was taking tea in the lounge when Inspector Collins approached her table. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who had made significant discoveries, but was not entirely pleased with their implications. "Miss Marple, might I have a word, in private, if you don't mind?" They retired to a secluded corner of the writing room where the inspector spoke in hushed tones. "I've followed up on your suggestion regarding the identification of the deceased. The fingerprints don't match any in our records, but I took the liberty of contacting the London authorities with a description and photograph," prompted Miss Marple, stirring her tea with deliberate calm. "And it seems that a Miss Elaine Montgomery of Kensington was reported missing by her household staff approximately 2 weeks ago. The description matches our victim, but," he lowered his voice further, "according to the London police, the real Elaine Montgomery has a distinctive birthmark on her left shoulder. Our victim does not." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And the gentleman presenting himself as Harold Montgomery?" "We're making inquiries," replied the inspector grimly. "But I must ask, Miss Marple, what led you to question the identity of the deceased?" "Several small inconsistencies," she replied, "particularly regarding the timing of certain events. If you'll excuse me, Inspector, I believe I shall observe the morning routine tomorrow with particular attention. I find the early hours most illuminating." True to her word, Miss Marple positioned herself in the hotel foyer shortly after sunrise the next day, with her knitting as a plausible excuse for her presence. She observed the meticulous ballet of the hotel's morning preparations. Mr. Peterson inspecting the guest register, Mrs. Lacey distributing the day's duties to her staff, James polishing the brass fixtures with careful attention to detail. At precisely 7:30, Violet and another maid appeared with fresh flowers for the public rooms. As they arranged the blooms in various vases, Miss Marple engaged them in gentle conversation. "I must compliment you on the efficiency of the service here," she remarked, "though I couldn't help but notice that the tea tray delivered to the Montgomerys' room yesterday arrived at an unusually early hour." Violet paused, a puzzled expression crossing her face. "Tea tray, ma'am? I don't recall any tea tray being sent up to Mr. Montgomery's room yesterday." "How curious," replied Miss Marple. "Perhaps I was mistaken. It was James who I observed carrying it just after 7 o'clock. Later, as Miss Marple descended for breakfast, she encountered James in the corridor. The young man appeared troubled, and she seized the opportunity to inquire after his well-being. "It's all this business with the Montgomerys," he confided. "Inspector Collins has been asking about the routine deliveries to their room, and there's something that doesn't quite add up." "Indeed," prompted Miss Marple gently. "Well, you see, after Mrs. Montgomery, after the accident, Mr. Peterson instructed me to deliver breakfast to Mr. Montgomery's room each morning. But yesterday, when I arrived with the tray, I could have sworn I heard a woman's voice inside the room." Miss Marple's eyes widened with interest. "How very curious. And did you mention this to Inspector Collins?" "I did, ma'am. He seemed most interested." James glanced nervously over his shoulder. "I should return to my duties. Peterson is rather particular about timekeeping." As James hurried away, Miss Marple made her way to breakfast with a thoughtful expression. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align in her mind, forming a picture that was as disturbing as it was complex. Later that morning, she dispatched a carefully worded note to Inspector Collins, requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience. The response came with gratifying promptness, a brief message indicating that the inspector would call upon her at 3 o'clock. As she waited in her room for the appointed hour, Miss Marple methodically reviewed the events of the past days, arranging the various inconsistencies and observations into a coherent narrative. The picture that emerged was one of carefully orchestrated deception, timed with precision and executed with chilling calculation. When Inspector Collins knocked on her door at precisely 3 o'clock, Miss Marple greeted him with the serene smile of one who has successfully completed a particularly challenging piece of needlework. "Do come in, Inspector," she said. "I believe I can explain exactly what has occurred at the Seaview Hotel, and why a woman who was never Elaine Montgomery met her unfortunate end on the beach below." Chapter 5. The Final Revelation. Inspector Collins leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face intent as Miss Marple prepared to share her conclusions. "It was quite an elaborate scheme," she began. "The woman we knew as Elaine Montgomery was never the real Elaine at all, but an imposter, Clara Dawson, working with Harold Montgomery to steal the real Elaine's identity and fortune. The real Elaine Montgomery was abducted in London 2 weeks ago," Miss Marple continued. "Harold and Clara forced her to reveal banking details, then Clara assumed her identity while they established an alibi here at the Seaview. James was their accomplice, helping maintain the illusion that Elaine was still at the hotel after Clara changed her appearance to become a new guest." Inspector Collins frowned. "But the body on the beach was the real Elaine Montgomery brought here secretly and murdered. The hotel routines provided perfect cover for their switches. The telegram that so distressed Harold contained news that their scheme was discovered in London." As Miss Marple finished explaining, a commotion erupted in the corridor. Harold Montgomery, having overheard everything, attempted to flee but was swiftly apprehended by waiting constables. Later, Miss Marple explained to Violet how her observations in St. Mary Mead had trained her to notice the impersonation through subtle details of behavior. "Our habits reveal our true selves," she concluded gently, "something no imposter can ever fully disguise." As she packed for her return to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected that once again human nature had proven as predictable at a seaside hotel as in her quiet village.